Germany has long been seen as the economic powerhouse of Europe, yet its foreign policy has always been far more complex and less well understood. Seemingly afraid of pushing its weight around, it long seemed to sit back, allowing France and Britain to take the European lead. More recently, though, many have felt that it should be more active and a lot more assertive, especially with Russia. But just how exactly does Berlin see the world and Germany's place in it? To discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined by Constanze Stelzenmüller, Director of the Centre for United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. So, hello, Constanze. Thanks so much for joining us. I think really perhaps the best thing to do is maybe start from the beginning, if you like, of modern German foreign policy and talk about that period after 1945. I mean, Germany had been divided. You had a West German government. I mean, how did it really evolve in that period?
First off, thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast. This sounds like a fascinating undertaking and a great series of public education segments that you're doing. It was a really good idea. Perhaps let me sort of say some things about myself to situate where I come from, as it were. I'm sure that's helpful. I'm German. I'm West German. Or rather, I was born at what was then West Germany, and in fact in the capital, in Bonn, in 1962. And as I was just saying to you earlier, my parents were war children. And my father was in the German Foreign Service. So I have had an insider-outsider take on my own country's politics for quite a while. And I've been myself in the business of writing and thinking about German foreign policy, first as a journalist and then as a think tanker, for more than 30 years now. And of course, you know, the generational experience of my parents and my grandparents' generation also flows into how I think about these things. So if I say Germany in the Cold War, I usually mean West Germany unless I say so. For West Germany, after the end of the war and after the establishment of a German constitution, the so-called Basic Law in 1949, the first German governments and all successive governments really had one overriding goal, which was to take Germany out of its pariah status as the perpetrator of World War II and the Holocaust and a very, very significant co-perpetrator of World War I, and anchor it as firmly as possible in the West. That meant really three things. One, reparations and very close relations, especially with Israel, which went via the Jewish Claims Conference in the beginning, and then with the Israeli state. I would add as a footnote that the reparations went to a rather smaller group of people than today we would consider appropriate, but that would be a wholly separate topic. The second step was close relations with our former enemies, the countries on whom we had declared war. That in particular was France. And then finally anchoring in what was and still is called the West, although that seems a little sketchier these days than it was for a long time in your and my life. And that meant a very close relationship with the three occupying powers, which, remember, the US, the UK, and France were occupying powers in West Germany until reunification and the 2+4 treaty in 1990, a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it meant membership in the European Union, in NATO, and in the United Nations. And West Germany took that extremely seriously. At the same time, in parallel, East Germany, of course, was a member of the Warsaw Pact. It had no choice in the matter. In fact, Warsaw Pact countries were told not to accept Marshall Plan money, remember, by the Soviet Union. And the other element, of course, that came into West German foreign policy over, let's say, the late 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, what was called Ostpolitik, which was an attempt to establish good working relations with Eastern Germany. something that was viewed with a great deal of apprehension, suspicion by some of our Western allies, but which was always seen as a way of, maintaining a bridge, balancing out German foreign policy. Maybe we can go into more detail about that. But those were the paradigms in which West German foreign and security policy was inscribed until 1989 and 90, the fall of the war and reunification.
And that obviously brings on quite nicely to that transition to from the end of the Cold War. We had the end of the Soviet Union, German reunification, and suddenly it seemed that we were all in a very, very different world. But Germany, it seemed, had it was thrown into a very different type of situation. After reunification. And there was a sense that there were some missteps along the way. And, I've worked a lot on the Balkans, and Germany was heavily criticized for what many regarded as the premature recognition of Slovenia and Croatia, which famously prompted the Greek foreign minister to refer to Germany as a bestial force with a child's brain. Rather, he got into all sorts of trouble for saying it. But there was that sense that Germany was suddenly potentially this big new actor in Europe in the post-Cold War era. But it did seem that it found it a little bit difficult to find its footing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, perhaps, again, sort of a personal word here. I went to law school in Bonn, the West German capital, in the first half of the 80s. And I remember vividly the famous anti-Pershing demonstrations, which at their height in 1982 doubled the population of Bonn by 300,000 in a day, right? I was in those demonstrations simply because I was trying to get from my student housing to my law school classes. And I also remember very vividly the sense of leaden sameness that pervaded the general politics in West Germany of the time. My generation was the second largest birth cohort post-war, and the universities didn't want us, the labor market didn't want us, and there was a feeling that we were conscribed in every way, and there was really no way to sort of, there was, remember the punk slogan, "No future"? You didn't have to be a punk, right, to feel that there was some truth to that. And of course, what also weighed on us, right, was the knowledge that if the Cold War ever turned into a hot war, right, there would be an estimated 3 weeks of conventional warfare between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and that would then go nuclear, and Germany would be ground zero for that, and we would become a pile of white ash. That genuinely shaped a feeling, not just of European and West German punks, right, but of all of us. So not only did a lot of us go off to other countries to finish our university studies or stretch them out, right? But to escape that feeling of futurelessness. And so I can, it's hard to describe today, right? The astonishment and joy that overcame us when the wall came down, right? Completely to at least our surprise. I was actually going to graduate school in America, and a friend of mine called me and said, "Constanze, turn on the TV, the wall's down." And I said, "Pull the other one." And she just said, "Go to the TV, turn it on, you will see." And I surprised myself by bursting into tears, right? I had no idea that I had emotions attached to this. But yes, it's fair to say, right, that was, while it was an incredibly exhilarating time, it was also, there was also something else that happened emotionally to many of us, because I think many of us had gotten used to the idea, very sort of comfortable, lazy, and not very courageous take, that the Berlin Wall surely, couldn't be the only thing that was keeping East Germans in East Germany and Poles in Poland and so on, right? We didn't take the civil society movements and the protest against communist governance as seriously as we should have, right? And I realized after the fall of the wall just how appalling these regimes had been, for which I'm ashamed to this day, right? So, in other words, as we were exhilarated and astonished at the notion that there might be an end to history after all and that politics could change so fundamentally, and that grassroots movements and civil society could change regimes and change the course of history. At the same time, there was a distinct, really strong sense of shame, right, at how much we'd gotten wrong. Right. But that was intensely liberating, all of it, even the shame. And I always say, to explain this to sort of younger friends, that I think West Germans in particular had become so used to trotting within the confines of sort of, not getting outside of the good graces of the occupying powers, being in line with what NATO wanted from us, being a good European citizen, that we had never managed the strategic imagination and energy to articulate a sovereign foreign and security policy. It was just not a mental habit that we had learned. And I, as a student, was fascinated to learn in international strategy and security courses that other countries did this, very energetically. And I always felt that that was something we needed to catch up on. But yes, you are correct. And when you pinpoint the early recognition of Croatia and Slovenia, I would just say, in all fairness, that in these early wars of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which led to genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes in the Balkans, which we were very slow to recognize, just as we were very slow to recognize what was happening in Rwanda. And both these genocides, of course, contradicted the notion that eternal peace was now going to break out everywhere. I would just say, that Paris and London, for their part, took the side of Belgrade for far too long, right? And therefore of the Bosnian Serbs. And so therefore, while we were out there first, certainly, past the post, in the early recognition of Croatia and Slovenia, I think all of us Europeans have some blame to share for not understanding the gravity of the situation, taking sides too early and for too long, and then for having to be basically bailed out by the Americans yet again. Again, for younger hearers in particular, I think one can be forgiven in the 90s for thinking that really the course of history had changed, because not only did the wall fall down, right, and the East Germans liberate themselves, the Warsaw Pact disappeared and the Soviet Union disappeared in December 1991. The Eastern European nations, the Balts first, declared independence, and then in successive waves joined the European Union, NATO, and ultimately the Eurozone. Under, of course, benevolent American oversight, right, and with grave reservations in London, in Paris, and in Berlin, about which we also need to be very honest. But it happened, and we became a much larger, stronger, more diverse, and I think more attractive Europe. The other thing that happened was that democracy movements in Latin America, in Asia, South Korea especially, and in Africa, right, chased out what the Africans would call old crocodiles, right, and installed democratic regimes. And so I think we could be forgiven for thinking that sort of market capitalism and democratic transformation was the major trend of the future, and that the genocides in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia were regrettable aberrations. Where we failed to see the warning lights flashing, I think, was in the ghastly impact of the Iraq and Afghanistan war on the region and on our own societies, then the global financial crisis in 2008, which morphed into the Eurozone crisis, which really, really put enormous economic and political social tensions into Europe. And I think laid the groundwork for the rise of the hard right before the migration crisis ever happened, right? And so yes, I mean, I would say that Germany had a very, very long and steep trajectory to follow. Let me make one final point here, if I may, which is that also something that people forget. When the wall fell and the Soviet Union disappeared, the general assumption, grounded in first the Rwandan and the Yugoslav genocidal experience, the sending out of crisis management and peacekeeping missions, and then the attacks of 9/11 and the sending of stabilization missions and fighting forces to Afghanistan, the assumption was that NATO would have to, and especially the Europeans, would have to now forever switch from territorial defense to crisis management, stabilization, peacekeeping, and expeditionary warfare. And no country had farther to go than Germany in this, in all of Europe, because we had a heavily land-based fighting force, which again, to tie back to my earlier point, was supposed to protect the inner German border, 1,700 kilometers, for about 3 weeks until the onset of nuclear warfare, right? There are few armed forces less prepared for expeditionary warfare than we were, right? And we sort of forced ourselves to do all that only for the Russians to invade Ukraine on February 24, 2022, and NATO to revert again to territorial defense.
I want to come back certainly to Germany's relationship with Russia, but I think one of the other things that I think was always interesting is that that sort of sweep after the turn of the millennium, there was a real sense, certainly as sort of seen from the UK, that when it came to Europe, Germany really was the economic powerhouse, but it had taken a step back on foreign policy issues. It was almost as though it felt that it didn't want to be too dominant across too many areas, and that foreign and defense policy really was something that fell much more into the hands of Britain and France. For all sorts of reasons. But of course, one has that sense that things had changed, and Brexit was obviously a really significant step in that regard, of Britain stepping back, stepping out, wanting to break all ties. Regrettably, as you can imagine, is my view on this. But it did sort of suddenly seem to be a sense that it was that was the moment that maybe Germany realised that it would have to step up on foreign policy as well, or would that be a fair characterization?
I think that's certainly true. But I think it was, I mean, if as a 3-decade-long Germany watcher here, that was a major waypoint for this development. But I think it sort of this really went in fits and starts over the past 35 years. I think the break really comes between the era of Kohl, Schröder, Merkel, and the era of Scholz and Merz. And Merkel is, in many ways, the incarnation and the high point of German incrementalism, right, and caution, in many ways, and which I think, again, to be fair, at the time, to many people seemed eminently sane. Certainly had broad backing in the German electorate, had broad backing in German politics, and there were only a few of us, right, who thought that they were seeing tsunami waves curling on the horizon, and thought that we were mentally, strategically, in terms of our infrastructure, our bureaucratic setup, and our politics, not prepared for this. And the metaphor that I often like to use, you may remember that in 2011, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Merkel made one of a very rare turn of the moment emotional decisions, and said that Germany would now go out of nuclear power. And what I often think about that moment is that it turned out that the engineers who had built the flood walls around the Fukushima nuclear plant, which was on the beach, had made a linear calculation of potential wave height, not an exponential one, and that turned out to be the lethal mistake, right? The development of tsunamis between when those calculations were made and when they hit in 2011 was not linear, it was exponential. And I often felt in retrospect that was what we were missing, right? The degree to which escalation risks have become mutually compounding and therefore exponential, and that requires a completely different way of thinking about the connectedness, the potential catastrophic impact, and the lethality of future political and security risks, right? And so, yeah, I mean, we have been playing catch up. I will say we were one of the last major countries in the West to give ourselves a national security strategy last year. It was a somewhat torturous and unattractive process, but we do now have one. And we are in the process, one hears, of finally setting out the basics of the new National Security Council, which would be the most significant strategic security policy innovation that Merz and his government, his grand coalition government, promised in their coalition agreement. That at least sort of sets up the sort of basis and as it were the bureaucratic casing, right, for the thinking and the policy making to take place. You can argue that it's still behind the curve, but I would also say, again, to be fair, that the direction of travel is, I think, irreversible. And you mentioned Russia earlier. I think that it is, despite the rearguard battles of parts of the German right and the German left, who still want to have a good relationship with this Russia, which I find hard to fathom. That's putting it politely. I think the great majority of the political class, policymakers, and the electorate, are fully aware of what this regime is and of the brutalities, the horrors it is wreaking in Ukraine every day. And something very similar is true of China, right? The direction of travel there is very clear. The relationship has become much more fraught, much more careful, and security now, I think, outweighs other profit considerations. The problem being is that we are much more dependent on China than we are on Russia. We were able in 22 to disentangle ourselves fairly quickly from Russian fossil fuel sources. It is far more difficult to disentangle ourselves from the very strategic and very deliberate Chinese investments in European politics, in physical and digital infrastructure.
Reminds me of Johannes Hahn when he as a European commissioner for Austria, sort of saying that in many ways Europe overestimates Russia and underestimates China. There was that sense of a complex relationship between Germany and Russia, much more complex than many other European countries, and certainly viewed from outside of Germany. This sort of sense that why wasn't it doing more on Ukraine? Why has it been holding back? Has been something I think that many Europeans have been asking themselves. And then some said, well, look, it's obviously energy related. But there was also a sense of maybe a more historical understanding of that relationship with Russia.
Yeah, I personally think that that's overrated. That line of analysis. I think it's true for an older and at this point much older generation, right? The older end of the boomer generation, for whom this was a sort of lodestar of German foreign policy growing up, right? And which of course came with a very odd omission, right, of all the countries in between, especially of the region that Timothy Snyder, the Yale historian, has very appropriately called the bloodlands between Poland and Ukraine, where some of the most horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity of the Nazis and the Soviets were committed in World War II. What has always struck me very unpleasantly about this particular sort of line of, I'm just going to say, sentimentality towards Russia, right, and guilt towards Russia, is that it is not accompanied by any sentimentality or guilt or remotely appropriate will to atone towards the countries of Eastern Europe in between, who in many ways were felt the scourge of the Nazis at least as badly or worse. So that I think that line of argument is, but that generation was retiring from politics and political influence, right? By the time it was still very present in 2014 when the Russians annexed Crimea, and when the Germans and Angela Merkel threw themselves behind the Minsk Accords, which, as we have now known for a decade, gave the Russians cover to continue war in the Donbass and expose the Ukrainians to terrible risk, right? 10,000 people died in that decade. in those wars, which really was a proxy war between Russia and the West already. But I think by 2022, a new political generation had taken hold of the reins in German politics, and I think felt distinctly more skeptical or alarmed or horrified by what was happening, and so the sort of the sniping about the need to maintain a good relationship with Russia, that comes either from a much older generation that feels it's being somehow delegitimized ex post facto, or from the hard left, or from the hard right. But it's not it's a very minority opinion in the mainstream. Habits, the sort of self-imposed constraints on thinking are very hard to extirpate. I used to joke, and if you allow me, I'll say that here. It's a bit hard to translate, but that we had sort of three major constraints: Normzwang, Bündniszwang, and Sachzwang, which is the international law forces us to do this, the allies are forcing this to do us, or facts are forcing us to do this, right? And if we're completely honest, West German governments before the fall of the wall were very, very good at pursuing the national interest, while complaining about being forced to do something by the Allies or by international law or the facts. So again, you have to sort of look very closely at that particular theory. So I don't know. I mean, I think we are alarmed enough now, right? I think there's lots of things that's in movement. As you know, we've loosened the constitutional debt brake to allow for massive amounts of defense spending and infrastructure spending, which is less of a cop-out than it may sound to some people, right? Just for reference, we promised in the Hague NATO summit in June to President Trump and our other allies that we would all spend 5% on defense, broken down into 3.5 on actual military kit, and 1.5% on infrastructure. And for the Germans, that is less of a cop-out than you might think, because we are literally the hub of the wheel for any movement of kit and personnel and troops in Europe. Right? A continent that does land defense and land deterrence is going to need German infrastructure to actually work, and there's some work to be done there.
Talking about the United States, where you're based, and the relationship between Europe and the United States, and how Germany views that, because obviously we are dealing with a second Trump presidency where things have been thrown into absolute turmoil. What's your thinking about how Germany is responding to this?
It's difficult, and the difficulty starts with the fact that we owe so much to the Americans, right? Remember, Lord Van Sittart is now a historical figure, remembered by few, but he and I think Robert Morgenthau, if I remember the name correctly, were arguing immediately after the end of the war that West Germany should be deindustrialized and turned into an agricultural country so as to eliminate any possibility or risk of its ever threatening its neighbors again, or the world. And it was the Americans who said, looking at the rising specter of an imperial, possibly aggressive communism, that West Germany was going to be needed as a NATO member to hold the line, and that therefore it was wiser to engage in market capital, political and democratic reform in Germany and midwife that. And they very carefully midwifed the German Basic Law in 1949. Many of the actual midwives concerned were German Jewish lawyers who had fled the Nazis to America in the 1940s or 30s, if they were wise, and come back, right, and advised us. Some of them even came back to live in Germany, right? And this was a very benevolent tutelage. The other thing, perhaps, to keep in mind that is very specific to Germany in the post-Cold War era and the Cold War, is that because of the large number of American bases in Germany, there was a great deal of casual fraternization, right? What Germans knew of pop culture, they owed to GIs right? And GIs who retired in Kaiserslautern or Frankfurt and opened jazz bars, right? And people got married and had children, right, and went back and forth. And so there is, in fact, just if I look here at my own institution, I have the feeling that half my colleagues in the IT department, right, had spent time in their childhood on an American army base in Germany. All that and more created a sort of amicable, right, mutual understanding that it was very real. In West Berlin in particular, Berliners were so grateful for the Berlin airlift, right, that to this day, that this is the most pro-American town in Germany. People play softball along Clearly in Dahlem, and the American ambassador's 4th of July party used to be the year's most popular party in Berlin. Now, again, this has a dark side as well. Of course, the relationship was one of codependence, and the American security umbrella and the American bases allowed us, particularly after 1989-90, when we thought, armed conflict was over, to disinvest in our defense and security and to spend it all on social peace. Not that the latter was wrong. And the latter was something that our allies were definitely keen on, because they were worried that we might, if you put the lid off the top of the pot, something might happen. I vividly remember in CBS, I think it was, broadcast in 1989 when I was at graduate school, leading with the Chiron, will German jackboots now march across Europe again? That was the first time I ever wrote, as a student, a reader letter to the New York Times together with my fellow students, when we said that this was hysteria. But this sort of codependence, which was in some ways amicable, in other ways hypocritical, even resentful, right? And at that level, certainly shameful and embarrassing. That codependence, I think, has been ended quite brutally. And if it's an end to the hypocrisy and the whinging, I am for it, right? The greater problem, I think, is the unpredictability and the predatory nature of some of sort of this administration's ambitions, and beyond that, I think the quite extraordinary amount of simultaneous revisionism that it has articulated, right? Attempting to articulate the world security order, trade order, energy order, currency order, and digital order at the same time, restoring, quote unquote, America to its rightful apex position, to redress supposed unfairness. And I feel as though, this feels like an enormous sledgehammer being used against a number of items that actually aren't nails, but screws, and therefore will not lend themselves to being hammered in. And so that failure and chaos and damage, right, are going to reveal themselves to be quite monumental, right? And how we navigate that period as Europeans, as Germans, and as those of us who, still admire and love much about this country is, I think, the question of the future.
I guess if I might just have one final question
Sure,
sort of to come in, because obviously we do now have, well, maybe not quite as new a chancellor in Germany under Friedrich Merz, but what are likely to be the main foreign policy directions under this government? And of course, we've spoken about Ukraine, but the Middle East is a hugely important. We've had the major decision taken by France to recognize Palestine. Britain has fallen into line on that. There will be a lot of attention given to Germany on this issue. And because of that historical relationship with Israel, it's not going to be in a position to do that. But it's likely to be one of those issues which is going to become very, very significant, or is already very significant. But yes. are likely to be the other main sort of areas that we should be looking out for in terms, for example, of multilateralism? The UN is in crisis. Germany has been a big supporter of the organization. It must be looking in horror at the dire parlous state of the UN at the moment.
But it is an everywhere, everything all at once moment, right?
Mm.
And I mean, if I may briefly reference myself, I wrote a chapter on Germany in a Chatham House collection of essays on the future of the international order, sort of making that point that all the sort of the pillars or paradigms of German foreign policy and security policy that carried it not just through the Cold War but throughout much of the post-Cold War era are in play. Right, the future of the transatlantic relationship, the future of American stewardship of international order, the integration and enlargement of the European Union, and yes, the relationship with Israel, right? And while I believe Chancellor Merz and his Vice Chancellor, the Social Democrat Lars Klingbeil, both of them are committed transatlanticists and committed Europeanists, and I believe that to be really deeply rooted and authentic. I've met both of them. I've talked to both of them about this, and I completely believe them. What I worry is two things: whether they understand and are prepared for the degree to which transatlanticism and Europeanism now means something completely different than what they thought they did when they took up that belief, right? And navigating this moment with its inherent escalation risks, its confusions, the amount of aggression out there, the rise of the hard right, the rise of enemies of the West, requires a degree of strategic imagination, endurance, stamina, sophistication that would challenge even the strongest, right, and most experienced of politicians. And neither Merz nor Klingbeil have actually held national office before, right? And so much depends on their ability to manage their teams, to get the right people in their teams, to manage their teams, to manage processes, and I think their personal diplomacy with their peers in Europe and in NATO and elsewhere in the world, and with their ability to communicate all this to a justifiably frightened electorate. And I heard Joschka Fischer, the Germany's first Green foreign minister, right, who, together with Gerhard Schröder, took over in 1999 at the height of the Kosovo air war, if you remember that, and who himself was an Americanist and a committed Europeanist after having come really from quite far, sort of outer left field. And I saw the now quite elderly Fischer at a conference in April, and who said with a sort of real empathy, right, and real concern, saying that the only patriotic thing to do, right, was to wish this coalition every success, because they are what is standing between us, right, and the success of the hard right. And we haven't talked about that yet, but let me just say that the AfD is the most overtly, radically hard right party in Europe. It has just published a 6-page strategy paper about how to split the Conservative Party, how to split the coalition, right, and how to insert itself in power. And so far, it is visibly following that playbook. And we should all be very concerned about that. And we should really all, and certainly I wish this German coalition a lot of luck. If I may add one final point, because we haven't talked about that at all, is German-Polish relations. And I like to end on that note. I know one isn't supposed to make temporal references in podcasts, but I will anyway. Yesterday, on Wednesday, the new Polish president was installed, took his vows, and gave a very, as we know, he's a sort of right-wing populist. He gave a very combative speech, criticizing the center-right government of Donald Tusk, the prime minister.
Yes.
And which made some very combative remarks about the German neighbors. And on the same day, the government felt it necessary to not just fire the German-Polish coordinator, but abolish his office. And German National Radio ran an interview with his German counterpart, whom I also know, very decent man called Knut Abraham, who worked in the Chancellery and then ran for the Bundestag, and who said, we had absolutely no inkling that this was going to happen. We were caught completely unawares, and we're very concerned by this because this is one of the most important relationships that we have, and I can only I would put a triple underline under that, right? So if what we're seeing really is sort of hostility creeping even into the relationships that ought to be the closest of all. And since you mentioned Israel, no German government has been as challenged, right, as this German government by the Israeli government and by this hard right coalition of Benjamin Netanyahu's actions in Gaza. And it's clear that the pressure is mounting within Europe and within Germany and within the coalition and the government to be far firmer with the Netanyahu government than any German government would ever have thought it possible to be, right? And this is these three things: right? Washington, Israel, Warsaw. Again, were and are and should be the lodestars of any Berlin government's foreign relations, and it is all incredibly fraught right now. I think what's happening, what's helping right now, is that the Macron government is, unlike some of the others that I've just named, very willing to have a good relationship with Berlin. There are some points of tension, specifically on European policy, on financing European defense, on allowing American companies into the European defense market, that kind of thing. But those are not strategic questions. They're not questions about the nature and the intimacy of the relationship, right? But there too, the hard right is waiting in the wings. And I'll end on that.
Thank you so much for joining us to talk about all of this. I realized it was a huge sweep of history and themes to be talking about, but it was wonderful talking to you. And I hope that maybe we can continue the conversation at some point. But until then, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm grateful for the invitation. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Good to see you.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.